afternoon, everyone. My name is Justice, and it is my sincere pleasure to welcome you to this MHS webinar, Equitable Identification Using Universal Assessments and the Naglieri General Ability Tests, Verbal, Nonverbal, and Quantitative. We are thrilled to have you all here today and would like to begin by telling you a bit about MHS. For over 40 years, MHS has provided trusted data-driven solutions across our core disciplines: clinical, education, talent development, and public safety. Science and research are the basis of MHS's roots and future innovations. With new standards for tool sets, we help clients evaluate, track, and leverage human-centric data to help realize their full potential. We are guided by a clearly articulated digital trust framework to ensure that the rights and privacy of our clients are always protected. We strive for fairness and equity in the development and deployment of the products we make and the solutions we provide, and in the people we lead. MHS Education continues to provide the expertise and resources required to support the diverse needs of children and adolescents in and around the classroom. I would like to extend my heartfelt congratulations to Dr. Naglieri, Dr. Brulles, and Dr. Lansdowne for winning the 2024 Excellence in Equity Industry Impact Awards as authors, speaker, and consultant of the year, and for their exemplary work on the Naglieri General Ability Tests, which also earned the 2024 Excellence in Equity Industry Impact Award in the Diversity and Inclusion Solution category. Your contributions to equity and inclusion are truly remarkable. During this webinar, we will start with a presentation by Dr. Naglieri, Dr. Brulles, and Dr. Lansdowne. At the end, we will open the floor for questions. Now, without further ado, it is my great pleasure to introduce you to our presenters today. Dr. Jack Naglieri is an emeritus professor at George Mason University. He has published 23 books, 51 tests and rating scales, and 300 research papers. He is known for his emphasis on innovative tests, including the Naglieri General Ability Tests, Verbal, Nonverbal, and Quantitative, Cognitive Assessment Systems, 2nd edition, Autism Spectrum Rating Scales, and the Comprehensive Executive Function Inventory. He emphasizes equitable assessments and uniting sound theory with practice. Dr. Brulles is a gifted program coordinator at the Mary Lou Fulton Teachers College at Arizona State University. Her work emphasizes equitable identification and programming in gifted education. She is one of the authors of Understanding and Using the Naglieri General Ability Tests, A Call for Equity in Gifted Education, and the Naglieri General Ability Test, Verbal. Dr. Kim Lansdowne, founding executive director at the Herberger Young Scholars Academy at Arizona State University, received the 2023 Arizona Association for Gifted and Talented Lifetime Achievement Award. She is an active leader in the gifted education advocacy locally and internationally, and has published extensively, including co-authoring the Naglieri General Ability Tests Quantitative. Now over to Dr. Kim Lansdowne.
Hi, everybody, and welcome to our session today. We are so happy to have you here. Over the course of the next hour plus, we are going to introduce you to our new set of tests, and we want you to know that we have been in your shoes. I have been a teacher of gifted kids, every grade level. I've been a coordinator. I teach classes on testing and measurement. And so when we came to the table to put this together, we had all of that background, and we hope that you really enjoy our presentation today. Dina.
Hello, everyone. And my name is Dina Brulles. And like Justice said, I am on faculty at Arizona State University. And like Kim mentioned, as well as she did, I was a teacher, a bilingual teacher, an EL teacher, a gifted teacher, coordinator, director, and school administrator. And currently I am the coordinator at Arizona State University for the Masters in Gifted program. So once again, like Kim said, we've walked in your shoes. We have a lot of lengthy experience in the field, and we look forward to sharing some of that with you today.
Hi, everybody. Jack Naglieri. It's a real pleasure for me to be here today to share the amazing work that I've been able to do with my extraordinary co-authors, Kim and Dina. We'll tell you a lot about our story, but as far as my background, started out as a school psychologist, got very interested in test development in the late 70s, and worked as a professor in Northern Arizona, Ohio State, and George Mason. And I retired from university in 2010, and still obviously still doing things that I think are important and things that change lives of children, makes it better. So that's what we're about. Thank you. Okay, so in terms of getting additional information, you can go to the Naglieri General Ability Tests website. Everything is free there. And there's a lot of information about what we've done, how we've done it, videos, webinars, all that kind of information there. If you're interested in twice exceptional children, then you should go to the jacknaglieri.com website and look at my work that I've done there on individual administration and scoring of tests that help us understand why some children have dyslexia or other kinds of learning problems or strengths. So, why are we here?
I'd like to start off by discussing a clarification of terms between gifted and talented, because in our field, a lot of times we say gifted and talented. And our work really kind of separates these two, because there's gifted students who are really smart, who might not yet be very accomplished. And talented really refers to students who are very accomplished. They do well in school. So there's a separation of these terms in some regards. If some kids are gifted, some kids are talented, some kids are gifted and talented. Our emphasis today is going to be on those students who are gifted, who might not yet be very accomplished. So if I asked all of you what your definition of gifted and talented is, there would be a lot of different answers. The one that we're using today is from Francois Gagné, who says that giftedness designates the possession and use of untrained and spontaneously expressed natural abilities in at least one area. By contrast, talented designates the superior mastery of developed skills or knowledge in at least one area. You may have seen this chart before. It was developed in the 80s from somebody named Janice Sabos, who at the time was a gifted coordinator in a school where she was trying to help her staff understand the difference between bright children and gifted children. In other words, those that are talented and those that are gifted. If you scan through this list, you will see that a lot of times the bright child is the easier child to have in class. It's the child who works hard, answers questions, understands ideas, completes assignments, enjoys school, because school's really designed for them to be very successful. If you scan through the chart of gifted children, you'll see the traits described here are those kids who are very curious. They ask a lot of questions. They are intense. Maybe they enjoy learning, and it might not be what you're teaching because they have a lot of fantastic ideas, insights, background information that they bring to the classroom. So think about the differences between that bright child and the gifted child as we proceed through this presentation. The one thing that all gifted children have in common is that they have high ability. And these are some profiles of gifted learners that show the distinction. There's a lot of different profiles of gifted learners. You'll see that at the bottom one that's high ability, high achieving, that is that child who's gifted and talented. But there's a lot of other profiles in our field when we describe gifted children who might be missed, might not be recognized in your gifted programs. Some of those children are culturally and linguistically diverse. Some might be twice exceptional or very creatively gifted children. there might be some non-productive gifted children in your schools. These are the kids that concern us the most, the kids that have high potential, high ability, but they might not be gifted and talented. So our tests were designed to be comprehensive and identify some of those different profiles of gifted learners that other tests might have missed. The one thing that they have in common, though, is general ability. We'll be talking a lot about general ability throughout this presentation. General ability, all of those different profiles, all of those children do have this high ability, and that pertains to the ability to reason, sequence things, connect ideas across content areas, make connections, draw inferences. That's a fundamental aspect of how children learn and what we do in school with these kids. It's the key to measure general ability in a way that's not confounded by knowledge, is what our tests are about.
So, what did we discover? In 1975, I started working as a school psychologist at this particular school, Charles Champagne in New York. And I did what I was taught to do as a school psychologist. I gave a WISC and I gave an achievement test. And I noticed that the questions on the WISC, like vocabulary, general information, word analogies, arithmetic word problems, were very similar to the same kind of questions I had on the achievement test. That bothered me. It didn't feel right. When I finished my 3 years working as a school psychologist in Bethpage, I went to get my PhD and worked with Alan Kaufman. And the idea that verbal tests could be used as a way of measuring intelligence became less and less plausible for me. I started working as a professor in school psychology at Northern Arizona University. And while there, we did some work in the local school being in the Grand Canyon, the Havasupai tribe. And I still have the record form and the report that I wrote in 1981. And in this report, I described this young lady's ability on the what we would call today nonverbal test scores, quite average, but her verbal score is way, way below average. And in my report, I wrote that score cannot be considered an estimate of intelligence because the child speaks mostly Supai, not English. Well, I got a lot of pushback from my fellow psychologists at the department there, saying silly things like, well, Native Americans, they live out on the desert, they have to have good spatial skills, so their nonverbal scores are going to be high. My response was, that's kind of ridiculous because this person doesn't really speak English, and yet the verbal tests demand knowledge of English and other things like arithmetic word problems. So I wrote my first paper on equitable assessment in 1982. Does the WISC measure intelligence for non-English speaking children? Answer is clearly no. By the way, those same subtests are still on the WISC today. And they're on a lot of the individually as well as group administered measures of ability. Now, to clarify this, I'm going to show you a few examples of tests that demand thinking and tests that demand knowing. So if you look at this problem, in order to solve it, you have to look at this relationship and then this one to arrive at the solution, which would be number 2. So this is basically an analogy. And to illustrate, I'll give you a verbal analogy that has the same structure. girl is to woman as boy is to, of course, the answer is easy. It's man. Here's a mathematical analogy of the same type. 3 is to 6 is 5 is to 10. Now I'll give you one that I bet very few, if anyone, can answer. And that's this one. C7 is to F as E7 is to. If you are a musician, you know the answer to this is A. But if you don't, you would be like that young lady that I assessed in Havasupai village who couldn't define words that she never had the opportunity to learn. So this concept of measuring thinking in a way that's not influenced and confounded by knowing is the centerpiece of what the three of us have done with the 3 new Naglieri tests. So whenever you look at a test question or the work that a student does, it's always important to ask yourself, what does the student need to know to answer the question? So if a student is trying to decode a word, they have to know the sounds associated with the letters and letters groups, for example. And how does the student have to think to complete a task? Well, if the task is reading comprehension and the teacher asked, what's the best title for this story? Well, that's going to involve understanding the relationships of all the ideas in the text that was read. So these are the kinds of things that you have to do to separate out thinking versus knowing. Now, as a psychologist in 1975 versus a psychologist today, my understanding of where we are today is critical and dependent upon the history. So let's get a little bit of understanding of the history. So I'm sure you all heard about Alfred Binet and Simon. Now they created a couple of different versions, of collections of items, questions. And when Binet created his final version, he took out of the previous set questions that depended too much on school learning, because Binet literally wrote that information, things you learn at school, should not influence the score you get when you're trying to measure intelligence. So I think Binet was separating thinking from knowing. Terman comes along, and Terman, in my estimation, arrogantly decides that verbal is the highest form of mental ability, and that becomes the Stanford Binet, which had been criticized for being too verbal from the very beginning. Now, Terman had a student. His name was Arthur Otis. Otis was the key person who helped develop the US Army Alpha and Beta, which were verbal and nonverbal tests and quantitative used during World War I. And there was an examiner who gave those tests, happened to be stationed in Fort Logan, Texas, and that person was David Wexler. So that's why there's information, similarities, arithmetic, those kinds of questions on the WISC, because it goes all the way back to Terman. And this notion of having verbal, quantitative, and nonverbal is reflected on the WISC, it's reflected on the COGAT, it's reflected on the Otis Lennon. This is where it came from. There's no magic. This is the format. If you look at the tests that we use to identify gifted kids. If you look just at the test questions, everybody demands knowledge. And if you think about it, it's not only the knowledge of the test questions themselves, but it's comprehension of the directions. Like some of these tests, like COGAT, for example, have very lengthy verbal instructions with a lot of verbal concepts in them. And then, of course, the individually administered tests, those demand expression of information. Now, you've probably heard people say, well, we can give a test like the WISC or the COGAT to identify gifted kids because they don't have test bias. Well, that's not the whole story. The standards for educational psychological testing describe test fairness as the combination of test bias, which is a lot about the inner workings of tests, and test equity, which is about the content of the questions. So the standard's right. If a person has had limited opportunities to learn the content in a test of intelligence, that test may be considered unfair because people simply haven't had the opportunity to learn. So fairness is a two-dimensional function. You have to look at both. Now, how do you know if a test is fair or not then, based upon its content? Just look and see if there are differences in average scores by different groups. And in this study that Dina and Kim and I wrote in our book, we pulled together a lot of research, all I could find, on average scores between groups by race and ethnicity. And what you see, if you look at the top, 6 to 9 point differences. At the bottom, 3 to 4 point differences. When you take knowledge out of the measurement of ability, you get equity. And that's the key. And it's not my opinion. I'm making that statement based upon all the science. The impact. Well, again, in our book, we remind people that there's approximately 1.25 million children of color in public schools today that are smart enough to be in gifted programs, but don't get in. And a big piece of that is the tools that are used to identify these kids in the first place. And of course, we have the inverse problem in terms of over-identifying Black kids as intellectually disabled. And then COVID comes along. So now think about this for a second. If you're using an Otis Lennon, a COGAT, a WISC, a WJ, or a Stanford Binet, they all demand knowledge. But what happened over COVID? Kids didn't learn. So in that instance, then, you don't really know how much the score that you get from a test that demands knowledge is a function of influence of COVID or not. Fortunately, our 3 tests are post-COVID norms, and they don't involve knowledge. So we're doing everything possible to get good, accurate assessment of everybody. So let's talk about what we did.
The 3 of us have been working together for quite a long time, probably about 20 years. And many years ago, Jack said to us, there's got to be a way for us to measure a verbal and quantitative ability with kids that don't speak English, that don't have a rich educational background. And we looked at him and like he'd grown another head. And we said, okay, when you figure that out, let us know. And he did. He called us about 10 years ago and said, okay, I think I figured it out. Let's get together and let's try to develop these some tests that do not have academic knowledge, that do not have English language, that don't have any language. So this is how our tests started out. We wanted to explicitly create tests that resulted in equitable identification. And to do that, we knew that we needed to take out the academic knowledge, but we also needed to make sure that kids could answer these questions regardless of the language that they spoke. We didn't want the test to be confounded by lengthy verbal directions on how, or test administration. And we wanted to also remove the need for verbal expression like Jack was just discussing. So this is what we came up with. So I had the opportunity to work with Jack on the verbal test, writing the items for that. Conceptually, there's a concept that links these items together, and the student has to determine what that concept is. So if you look at these items, the pictures in this item, you're going to look at and think, how are they the same? How are they different? So they are all obviously vessels, they're containers. They all hold something, but how are they the same and how are they different? You can look at this and think the box is the only one that closes. The jar and the cup have a handle. The bowl is the only one with a vibrant color. The basket has holes in it, but they all are empty except for item number 2, picture number 2. That shows that it's full. So the concept here that the student has to come up with is that they are empty. And so all of the items will have some unifying concept that the child has to determine what is the correct answer for. And here are the directions on how the student learns how to take the test. So this is obviously a verbal item. Thought bubble there, thinking about the items. They're all fruit except for the chair. So that the chair is going to pulsate. Child knows and needs to go and select that answer. He goes back to the screen and you'll see that he chooses the wrong answer. This is intentional so that we can show the child how to correct if they want to change their mind. And then the arrow shows how to move on to the next screen.
So one of the things I just love about the animated directions, if we were all together in a place, which this is my question I always ask, is how many of you have administered ability tests to groups of students or even individual? And most of you have. Most of you are on this session having that experience. And so reading lengthy directions is really a challenge and has been. Dina and I joke a lot about, we were in neighboring districts in Arizona, and we would call each other because we were struggling to test kindergartners, so groups of kindergartners. And you start with lengthy directions, you're losing kids really early. So when Dina and I started working with Jack, that was like super important for us, that the directions were quick and easy and every kid understood them. So what we want to do now is we want to spend a little bit of time with you really immersed in the problems. So what I'd like you to do is you can use a tablet, you can use your phone, I don't care, or paper and pencil if you'd like to. You are going to write the numbers 1 through 11 down right now on whatever you're using. And we are going to practice, we're going to immerse you in these problems. What we want you to be able to do when you're done with this session is to really have an understanding of what these 3 different ways of expressing your ability, what that feels like. And some of you are going to find some of them easy and some of them more difficult. So now we are going to go through 4 verbal problems. So this is a first grade easy problem. On your paper, you're doing number 1. If you want to, and you're feeling really good about this, write down what you think the concept is as well. So let's go to number 2. So this is supposed to be hard. It's a first grade hard problem. It is supposed to be difficult. You should be taking some time to really think through this. It's always fun to hear the chatter on this one, isn't it, Dina? It's one of the benefits of being together in a group is that there's a lot of talk on this, and it's great talk. So Next one, number 3. This is a 6th grade easy problem. And Dina, would you explain at this time the norming process, how you worked with MHS in regards to cultures?
Oh, sure. So MHS did an amazing job working with 18 language experts from around the world. And what they wanted to do was make sure that there was not any issues or concerns with any of the items, how they were represented. And so you're not going to see a horse or a dog or a pig, for example. You're not going to be seeing the food items, and the items on the verbal tests are going to be universally accepted concepts. So it won't be offensive to anybody, regardless of their culture, and they'll be able to answer them understanding from where the items came from.
Okay, 6th grade easy. Let's do the 6th grade hard problem. So this is supposed to be difficult. This is challenging. So look through them. What do you think the answer is? And write that down. All right, Jack, next slide. Thank you. So Dina, can you just go through these problems in order and identify what the concept is for everybody?
So the 1st grade easy, the concept is growth. You can see that they're all living plants. The 1st grade hard, the answer is 4, is the table, because the concept is that they are all handheld except for the table. The 6th grade easy, all of the items have antlers except for the rhinoceros, which has horns. And the 6th grade hard is, the answer is going to be number 4, because they are all, the others are commercial institutions, where number 4 is the only residential.
Great, thank you. Let's go on.
Okay, so the nonverbal test is conceptually like my Naglieri Nonverbal Ability Test that I published, many times over. But I created new ways of making matrices. And some changes in colors and things like that, but it's basically conceptually the same. The idea is that the student needs to understand the logic behind the matrix. The directions are the same, essentially the same. Thought bubble directs the child's attention to something, right? In this case, the top part of the screen, and then the options. And so everything else is the same as what you just saw for the verbal. Zoom in, choose 2, go to 1, and move on.
Okay, again, we are going to have you practice some items. We really want you to get the feel of what the nonverbal test items are like. So you should be on number 4 right now on your paper, whatever you're using to write down answers. So this is a 1st grade easy problem. So we're not going to spend a lot of time on it. You can go on to the next, Jack. Thank you. This is a 1st grade hard problem. And when we are in person, there is a lot of discussion about this problem and the fact that it's a 1st grade problem. So see what you can come up with here. Thanks, Jack. Okay, 6th grade easy should be fast, should be quick and easy. What is the answer here? And then the next one is a hard problem. It's a 6th grade hard problem. It should be hard. So see what you can do here. It's funny when we see kids doing this problem, they actually like turn their bodies to see what the answer is. So that's a good hint for you. So now let's go back through those, and Jack's going to explain the logic between them.
So what makes this easy, obviously, is that it's a simple rectangle placed in a box right in the middle with an emphasis towards the left-hand side of the square. So that's what makes it easy. This is a lot different. Because what we're doing here is adding first column to the second column to get the third column. And then we also add as you go down, first row, second row, third row. And the students need to be mindful of the way in which the triangle covers the yellow rectangle at the top, and so on. So there's a lot of pieces and parts here. That's what makes it hard. That's also what makes it a good item. Again, this is an easy one, just a movement. That's what it is. That green rectangle is just moving down. That's why number 5 is the answer. And then this one is really also about movement, but in this case, the objects are moving in a circular manner around the space. And so it takes quite a lot of thinking and examining to arrive at the right answer.
The quantitative items use numbers and symbols. And again, once again, you just have to decipher the logic behind the relationships among the symbols and the numbers. We've talked a lot up until this point about confounding knowledge with thinking. And so I think it's important to point out that with these quantitative problems, there is some academic knowledge that you will find as you're going into these next few problems. Numeracy, you have to understand simple math in order to solve these. So just wanted to point that out. There are no verbal problems here. There are no math word problems. And the other thing, once again, that we want to point out is that there are no lengthy directions. And so we'll take a look at the directions for the quantitative next. Okay, so in this problem, you're going to see that it's algebraic, right? And so she's looking at the problem in order to determine an equal part on the scale. No language, you can speak any language and be able to solve this problem. So we are going to give you some quantitative problems for you to solve. So you should be on number 9. So this is an easy, first grade easy, should go along really quickly. And then number 10 next. This is hard. It's a hard problem. And yes, it is a first grade problem. So take a look at this and see what you can come up with. And then we've got a 6th grade easy problem. So take a look at this, think about the difference between 3 and 6, and then 6 and 11, and follow the pattern. Okay, now let's go back through them. So a first grade easy problem, you're just following the pattern, 6, 7, 8, 9, what comes next? So the answer is B, 10. The next problem is that problem that we talked about just a few minutes ago. It is a hard problem. And so I'm going to tell you a little story about Jack and Dina and I with this problem. So we were trying to come up with sample items for a 6th grade, for the middle school portion of the quantitative. And my teacher, one of my teachers at my school, brought her child to work with her this day that Jack and Dina and I were talking about this. And this was the problem that I presented to Jack and Dina. And Jack just said, I don't like the problem. It's too hard. And he was like, it can't be a sample item. It's too hard. We want 98% of the kids to get the sample items. And I wrote the problem, so I don't think it's that hard. So I said to Jack and Dina, hang on just a second, just wait a second. And so I went down the hall because all of the kids in my school were in class, right? So I went down the hall to my teacher's office and I got her daughter to step out into the hallway. And you'll see she's barefoot, like I surprised her. She had no idea what I was doing. And I had this item, I had this paper, and I said to her, can you solve this? And that's all I said. So we're going to show you on the next slide the video of her solving this problem. So I want you to listen.
They don't really matter because there's them on both sides.
Start again. I just started recording. Start again.
The hexagon and the triangle don't really matter, so we can forget about them because they're on both sides. So they're the same weight. So we've got 4 rectangles and 2 pentagons. So that means that a pentagon equals 2 rectangles. So we've got these. We don't know the weight of these, and they're in all of them, so it doesn't really matter. And that's going to be 1 pentagon. So it's that one. It's got a hexagon, trapezoid, and pentagon. It's got to be E.
That's it. Thank you. Yeah, that's it. That's it. That's great. It's got to be E. What I love this note. This student was 11 years old at the time, 6th grader. And the thing that every time I hear this again, I always just have to stop and think about. One of the things that she says towards the end of this is that these 2 things are left, and it doesn't really matter because they're in all of the answers. And so really high level thinking there. Now I go back to my computer with Jack and Dina on the call, and I show them this video, and I'm like, look, I just went and got a student, and she solved it. And Jack says, I still don't like it, and we're not using it as a sample item. So we got rid of it, and that's why I can show it to all of you right now, and not that we've got test confidentiality issues not happening here. So there you go. There's a fun story about that problem. Okay, last one we've got here. All right, so this is a 6th grade easy problem, and all you're doing here is thinking about the difference between 3 and 6, which is 3, 6 and 11, 5, 11 and 18, 7, 9, and so on. So the answer is B. So there you go. You've got all 3 types of tests here.
You might be wondering how many test items. There's 40 items for each grade level, and the students have 30 to 35 minutes, depending on the grade level, to complete the tests. There's no subtests like some other tests. There's just the verbal 30 minutes, quantitative and nonverbal, all about the same length.
And that's really important. And it's also important for people to understand that my NNAT3 is a different test than the 3 of these. The NNAT3 is a different publisher, and it's only nonverbal. What we have here are 3 tests that differ across verbal, nonverbal, and quantitative, of course. Now, one of the things that was really important to me, especially before we started to really advocate for the use of these tests, is to have some scientific support that, in fact, they are equitable. Equitable meaning they don't have content that leads to lower scores for certain groups. So the publisher did 3 studies, overall about close to 10,000 kids, K to 12, and they asked the same question 3 times. The question was, do we have any gender differences? No, on the nonverbal. Do we have differences by race or ethnicity? No. I expected these findings because with my NNAT, I found that for decades. But we also found out no parental ed level differences. And then, of course, the question became, well, could we really have that same kind of result with the verbal test? And we got no gender differences, no race differences, no parental ed level differences. And the same thing for the quantitative. So these 3 tests are 3 separate tests. You can actually choose any combination of these 3. I can tell you, because I've been studying the data that we have, when you give all 3, you will find more kids than if you give any one of these. So we have good science behind what we're doing. We also have technical manuals and administration manuals. And of course, those are jam-packed with a lot of good information. And the technical manual has a lot of additional information about psychometric issues and analyses and different kinds of ways of studying the items. The reports that you would get look like this. And notice that we give an example of each of the 3 types of items that correspond to each of the 3 tests. And then we have scores explained, and then the individual report for the individual student. We do have a lot of good comparisons by language, English speaking, non-English speaking, same kind of results. Same kind of results for males and females. And there's a lot of information available to you about reliability, validity, and fairness. So just keep in mind that these 3 tests measure general ability, or sometimes referred to with a little g, and the description, verbal, nonverbal, and quantitative, is not about some kind of ability. Those descriptions are related to the content of the test questions. That's why we labeled it verbal, nonverbal, and quantitative.
So after looking at those test items, you might be thinking that you will identify students that you didn't identify before. And the question is, what do we do with these newly identified students that may not have fit into your existing gifted program? We want to make sure that we have a place for these students, that we have services that are inclusive. When we're looking at equitable and inclusive gifted programming, what do we need to do differently? We have to change the way that we've been serving our students sometimes. So we've been talking a lot about multiple measures for our identifying gifted students, but we also have to think about multiple pathways. If we're identifying students that we didn't identify before, what might we need to do differently with our services? So I like to call this the gifted programming dilemma. What comes first, the chicken or the egg? A lot of times schools have this wonderful gifted program that they've been doing for 27 years or 15 years, and now they're identifying different students. So what comes first? In my eyes, I want to identify the potential that a student has and then determine how to serve that child. A lot of people have a great gifted program and look for cherry pick kids who will do well in that program. So let's look at the 4 most common gifted programming models in our country and examine those through an equity lens. So what you see listed here are the 4 most popular types of programming: cluster grouping, honors classes, enrichment classes, and self-contained programs. Regardless of the type of model that you have, we have to be more inclusive when we're identifying these students that we might have missed in the past. And these are listed in the order of inclusivity. Cluster grouping is a way that we can group students together based on their high ability into one classroom at each grade level, and then work on developing some of that achievement in whatever areas that they need. Honors classes, a lot of times we'll have honors classes in math and or reading, and we look for kids who are advanced in those classes. Well, if we cluster group them, we can see some of those strengths, and then we can end up placing those students in some of those honors classes or those advanced academic classes. Enrichment classes, all students need enrichment, right? But when your program is based just on enrichment, sometimes we lose sight of how that high ability affects their achievement. So what I would say is I would have a cluster classroom at every grade level, and then I would send those kids out to the honors classes who are ready for those advanced level honors classes, but bring the enrichment into the classes. And some of you might have self-contained gifted programs. Kim and I as coordinators had all of these models. Sometimes the self-contained program might be reserved for the students who have high ability and high achievement. But we want to make sure that we have a place for those students who have high ability who are not yet highly achieving, which is why we want to group them together.
So what we've explained today really is a very different way of approaching the identification of gifted children, and then also being able to provide them the educational opportunities that will allow them to succeed and flourish. And it does demand courage to think differently, to move away from the old methodology. But we do the best we can with what we know, and when we know better, we do better, as Maya Angelou said. And keep in mind that socially just identification really requires, on our part, to think about what we're doing, gather information to make good decisions, self-correct, and be focused on the research. So thanks very much for listening.
Thank you so much for that insightful presentation, Drs. Naglieri, Dr. Brulles, and Dr. Lansdowne. Now, on to our question and answer period. Our first question is, why would one of the other options, for instance, the box that closes, not be a possible correct answer? Dr. Brulles, would you like to answer that one?
Yes, each of the items, they're going to have what we call distractors. And a distractor means that it could possibly be an option, but it's not the best option. And we do that. We create these distractors in order to really hone in on the true concept of the item. And the funny thing is, when Kim and I were developing these items, we were also coordinators at schools. And so we would go into classrooms, gen ed, gifted, everything, every grade level, and we would give the kids some of these sample items. And then we would sit back and say, okay, talk about them. And the discussions were very rich and interesting and exciting. The kids got passionate about some of these items. They wanted to take screenshots. They wanted to continue to debate. They wanted to argue for their answers. And that really was telling us that they were complex. There's different ways of thinking about, but the data analysis that MHS, the researchers did, showed that to make a truly acceptable item, there had to be that complexity in it, because after all, we are measuring high ability.
That's great. Thank you so much. Our next question is, if each test is a standalone general ability test, why would I administer all three?
That's an excellent question. If I were to take the quantitative test, I probably would not identify. We all have different strengths and different ways of seeing things. And when I was working with the verbal items, sometimes Kim and Jack would say, what, can you explain this item to me? And so when Jack said, we're gonna identify more kids if you do all three tests, and just for that reason, although we are measuring general ability, we all take different approaches and have different backgrounds and different strengths. And that's why we're able to identify more kids if we give all three of the tests as opposed to one or two.
Okay, that's great. Thank you so much. Our next question is, are these tests designed for nomination testing or whole grade universal testing?
So these are not screeners. It is for universal testing. It is an identification tool. A lot of people sometimes will have screeners to help them decide who they want to officially or formally test. We strongly recommend testing a grade level or a group of students in order to get that sample. And a lot of times, what we're looking for is using building norms and local norms. And to do that, you do need to have a consistent group. It could be a certain grade level, could be 2 grade levels, it could be subgroups like EL students, and then compare those tests with those scores to see who has the highest scores in that subgroup. in your school. So what you really want to do is see what is your goal here. If I want to do a whole grade level of test for these for a specific school, I could do a different grade level at a different school or a different building. But normally what we want to say is that you're going to test a group of students with these tests, and they are true measures of general ability. So you need to use it as a screener.
Oh, okay, great. Thank you. Our next question is, so if the verbal, nonverbal, and quantitative describe the content of the test question, does it mean if a student scores high on one, or what does it mean if a student scores high on one but not the others?
Basically, it's the vehicle through which we identify high ability. So it could very likely be that, like I was mentioning before, that somebody scores high on one test, the verbal, and not so high on the nonverbal, but it's still a measure of general ability. Jack mentioned it's the construct of the test item that makes it verbal, quantitative, or not, or nonverbal. It's not the type of thinking, it's not the type of learning. It means that they have high ability. And in my eyes, that high ability can pertain to anything and everything the child learns in school. So I don't want to pigeonhole somebody who identifies highly on a verbal test and say, you don't have any opportunity to be advanced in math or science or a different subject area. I want to say it's general ability. Let's go ahead and go through the academics and see where your academic strengths are in each of those areas. And that could also help decide and design the instructional pathway for that student or the service. But it's all measuring general ability.
Okay, great. We have another question. Have you investigated whether there is a possible normative difference between American and Canadian children?
In previous research that I've done with my NNet, we found very similar scores for the US versus Canada. To my knowledge, we haven't made that comparison with the 3 new tests yet, but we will. And I'd be very surprised if there's much of a difference.
That's great. Thank you so much. I think I don't have any more questions. Is there anything else that either you or Dina would like to say just to wrap everything up, and then we can go from there?
I would just like to say that we've been struggling with this in our field for a very, very long time. There's excellent research, a lot of passionate folks, experts in our field that have been working on this for decades, trying to find tools for equitable identification. This is just a huge leap, a big step into that direction. And we're excited that you are thinking about looking for these kids, finding these kids that we have historically missed in our traditional ways of measuring general ability.
I'd like to come back to the screening question. I think that, the term screening tool, at least for me, typically is something that's not very good. It's short and doesn't have the breadth of the tools that we have created. And so I don't like to think of these as screening tools, but I do think of them as a first step in looking for children, where we test everyone in a grade. Everyone has the opportunity to demonstrate how well they can solve these problems, and that becomes part of a process where, and Dina, you experienced this for many, many years. You get the scores from the test, and you talk to teachers, and you get other data to make a final decision. So I would make a little distinction between calling it a screener or 3, because these are 3 separate tests. And when you test a child 3 times, it gives you a lot of confidence in, if you're finding something, you really found something.
Okay, Thank you. Actually, as you were speaking, we got more questions. So if you're still open to answering, I can go ahead and ask them. Is that okay?
Sure.
Okay. Many of the gifted children I work with are slower processors. How does this assessment accommodate for that?
Well, you're raising a question of processing speed. This is something that's often talked about as it relates to scores on a WISC. That particular score on the WISC has very poor validity. And even the concept of speed in general has very poor validity. I think probably when you say someone has slow processing speed, I think another way to look at it is they're probably being a lot more thoughtful and cautious. And that takes a little more time. So I don't think processing speed or even talking about processing speed is really very helpful. Now, having said that, when we created these tests, we looked carefully at how long it takes students to do it, and we give them half an hour. As Dina said, 30 to 35 minutes. It's plenty of time. The way that we would make a speeded test is that most people don't even get very far. And we give them a very short amount of time. But that's not what we did here. We give a comfortable amount of time, and I don't see any problem as it relates to, oh, these tests are very speeded. That's not the case.
I'd like to add that when we were practicing with the items with students before we published, and then of course after as well, I never really encountered kids that ran out of time to take this. As a matter of fact, usually they finished with several minutes to spare. And sometimes I even wanted to say, slow down, look at these items more carefully, because they can be very complex and very tricky. So some kids will fly through them like on any test, and some kids will take more time. But I've really never seen kids time out too much on this unless there was a personal physiological issue going on.
Okay, great. Thank you. We do have another question. Isn't creativity considered a component of giftedness? If so, could a highly creative child potentially give a different answer than what is traditionally expected on a verbal test?
Okay, as I mentioned before, we have what we call distractors. And sometimes, yes, we will see a child really gets, focus on one of those distractors and try to make a case for that item having a different answer. And as we know, gifted kids, they are very creative, and sometimes they're passionate about what they really strongly believe in and feel. And that is just part of the uniqueness of giftedness. But especially with actually with all of the items, there is a component of creativity where they have to really think and try to find that relationship and try to make sense of that item. And when you think about the nonverbal items, they have to find out a pattern. They have to decide a rule, and that's a very complex thought process as well. And it does take a lot of creativity. So I think that creativity is built in to a lot of the way we answer all of these types of questions. And because it's part of, you're right, it's part of being a gifted learner. There's one other thing I wanted to bring up, and I don't know if anyone's going to ask this, but when we were looking at the research, some of the research that was conducted after those initial tests that Jack mentioned with the parental level of education, the gender, and the race and ethnicity, we also recognized later on that there's no difference between EL and non-EL students. I mean, that is huge in my eyes, because those are a lot of the kids that we have traditionally missed. But the other thing with the parental level of education, you can have kids whose parents are doctors and lawyers and parents who are migrant farm workers, and they're going to have the same opportunity to demonstrate how they think, how they problem solve. And that creativity comes into that piece, that place as well. Because as we know, with the backgrounds of all of our students, they're going to have different strengths and different levels of being able to discern some of those nuances that creative kids quickly see.
Thank you. We received this question about local norms. One of the objectives was to address local norms. Why would one use local norms versus national norms?
Well, the value of a local norm is that it allows you to really understand where the student is in reference to children who are most like that person. So, for example, sometimes some school districts don't really represent the US population. And some school districts do. And if you're in a school district or in the school where the nature of the population is not so diverse as to represent the US population, that's when local norms really are very helpful. So they're going to compare a child's performance to other children very much like that child. And that's a really important thing that we try to do. With a national norm, that's why we spend so much time and energy to create the national norm, because the test's going to be used nationally. I think it's really a good idea to use the local norms and the national norms together. They provide different kinds of information, and both are valuable and both are helpful in slightly different ways.
Another way to look at it is your state mandate might say, like, I live in Arizona, our mandate says 97 or above on any one area of an ability test will have you identified as gifted. It doesn't say, though, that you can't identify kids at a different cutoff. And if you are like me, in my schools I've worked in, we have schools where we have a large amount of students identified using national norms. In that case, we probably don't need to use the local norms if those who are identified represent that school. But then there's other schools who almost nobody identifies based on that state criteria, because it's a very diverse school. So using local norms is going to allow you to recognize the strengths of students who might not identify at a national norm. It also helps us identify those kids who are furthest removed from the norm in that school, in each school. And those are the kids that typically need something additional, something different than the average students in that school, because once again, they are furthest removed from the norm in that school. And that's why we want to use local norms to identify high ability students in schools that we wouldn't where they wouldn't be identified using the national norms.
Thank you. We have another question here. If these skills measure untrained spontaneous abilities, does it still make sense to develop thinking skills, example, PETS curriculum or PETS curriculum in early grades? Will it develop their aptitude in general or for the tests?
I'm not familiar with that specific test, but I do agree that exposing all kids, and what we do is, in gifted, we call it front loading. We want to expose them to some of the critical thinking, the higher level questioning, all of those things to motivate them to think beyond their comfort level and to stretch their thought processes. And so exposing kids to those types of learning experiences are going to benefit all students, whether they ultimately become identified as gifted or not. The reason I did mention that Francois Gagne's definition of spontaneously expressed natural abilities is because we do believe that students have potential. They're born with a certain ability, but unless we develop that, identify that, and then develop it, they might never work to the potential that they might have based on their innate abilities. There is some reasoning behind that if we focus on the strengths, we're going to better develop those abilities and ultimately their achievement.
There was one more question about local norms. Just referring back to your our previous question, somebody had asked, are there any limitations to local norms?
Well, the beauty of using local norms is you can decide those based on your student population, based on each school. So, for example, when I was a coordinator at a district that had title schools, higher SES, and a whole lot of in between, we could identify, we could say, which is the top, say 10%, or there's many different ways that you can use local norms. You can rank order, you can do the certain percentage of the students scoring at a certain level on these tests, but you can fluctuate that, which is the essence of using local norms, based on the percentage of students you're trying to find who are furthest removed from the norm in that school. So there's a lot of flexibility in using local norms.
Thank you so much. We have no more questions. I want to thank you again, Dr. Naglieri, Dr. Brulles, and Dr. Lansdowne for a very informative presentation today. I'd like to thank all our attendees for joining us today. If we didn't get to your questions in this webinar, please send us an email at marketing@mhs.com, and we will forward your questions along to our presenters or to MHS staff. Thank you.
Thank you for being here.